Welcome to Wide World of News. I'm Mark Halperin. We're talking today about healthcare and medicine with a doctor who saw what was going to happen in the United States far before I certainly did, and far before a lot of people in government and public health did. Dr. Amy Baxter, CEO and Chief Medical Officer of Pain Care Labs, has been dealing with the world of pain, both the pediatrics and for adults, for a long time. She's not a pandemic specialist by any means, but Dr. Baxter, as far back as February, saw a lot of the things that have happened that have surprised so many people across the country. Dr. Baxter joins us from Georgia. Doctor, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Mark.
So you shared with me an email you wrote back in February, and I'm just so impressed and stunned by the things you saw. You talked about how it was going to spread. You talked about how the virus behaved, or how you thought it behaved at the time. You talked about what government might need to do. You talked about masks. You talked about people needing to stockpile things. You really had a pretty strong handle on what was going to happen. And again, it's not your area of specialty. What were you keying off of to be so wise and so able to see what was going to happen that many people, including people who are specialists in that area, did not see?
I think you give me a lot of credit. There certainly were specialists in January who were saying that this was going to happen. And the reason that I had been paying as much attention to it, in part, was because I happened to be in Wuhan, China, doing an entrepreneurial pitch deck. So here we are in Wuhan in early November, and I was in contact with one of the translators who was assigned to me, and kept hearing back and forth what was going on with Chinese New Year, which is a really big issue for anyone who's in manufacturing. I make medical devices, so we were acutely aware of what was happening with the Chinese New Year in manufacturing. And all of a sudden, my friend Abel went dark. And so as I was looking at the spread and anticipating what would happen with China would be replicated here, but perhaps a little bit shorter, a little bit less steep of a peak because we had warning, I heard about the case on February 22nd of the first spread in Italy that was community spread, meaning that there were no known contacts. And at that point, I knew what was going to happen, because our immune systems are no different than in Italy. If someone got it with no spread contact, that meant that it was spreading asymptomatically. That meant that the people who were traveling were already widespread, and it meant that it was just a matter of time until exactly the same thing was happening in the States.
Yeah, I know you want to try to deflect the credit, but I didn't even read the long list, the complete list of all the things you foresaw in late February. Now, by the third week of March, all this stuff was being talked about: widespread, stop shaking hands, shelter at home, masks, etc. But back in February, I know you're right. Some public health experts were raising the alarm in January, but not talking about these very specific things, which eventually ended up happening. One of the things you talked about was shelter in place, which we all, 2-3 weeks in the life of this country now is an eternity. What made you think? What were you keying off of to say that this extraordinary orders from the governors and with the direction from the White House? What made you think that early on that extraordinary action would have to be taken?
Well, primarily the issue was that was what was working in Wuhan. That once the shelter in place and the quarantine went down in Wuhan and Shenzhen and other places that were very populous in China, that's when the cases started to decline. So there was a very clear mathematical progression that until the shelter in place orders had been placed, the cases continued to rise. And this actually compounded the medical information about what the R naught was, the number that tells you how many people you can spread it to if you don't shelter in place, if you don't stop the normal communication and the normal interactions.
I've resisted for the most part in Wide World of News trying to second guess what happened. I think there'll be plenty of time for that. I've mostly tried to encourage people to be forward looking about how to grapple with what's present now and we're facing the future. But I want to ask you, as someone who really has been so smart on this, if we turn the clock back to, say, early February, there's some argument that says, rather than having shut down the whole economy and houses of worship, etc., we should have focused on isolating the people who were most vulnerable, the elderly people with pre-existing conditions that make them more susceptible to serious health problems and perhaps death. would that have been a workable project if we'd started it early on to balance protecting the most vulnerable with not having all the cataclysmic effects of shutting down the country?
I don't think so anymore. I used to think so. The issue is that 44% of spread happens before you're symptomatic. And all of our focus early on was on fevers, was on symptoms. And with the paper that came out 2-3 days ago, we now know that about half of the spread goes with no symptoms. So trying to protect the elderly wouldn't have worked because the caregivers, the people coming to them, could have been infectious with no symptoms. The other thing that makes me feel like it wouldn't work is that we've clearly proven that a for-profit healthcare system with testing isn't going to work. And the reason is because all of the tests and all of the companies making them have their own reagents and their own printer ink, if you will. So
Right.
because all of these tests are being made and approved from very individual private vendors, we don't have a way to test enough to isolate and quarantine. So I think that
Right.
that even had we shut down appropriately early on, unless we had really done it from the very first week of February, and unless we had access to the kind of testing that you've been advocating, it wouldn't have worked then either. I think the unfortunate thing is at this point, we are going to have to burn it out to, and herd immunity is going to be almost impossible to do, but it's going to be a matter of a race between time for a 60% attack rate, meaning that 60% of people have been exposed, had it, and recovered.
Mhm.
Or we're going to find some way to decrease the severity so that getting it isn't a 20% severity and death sentence for 5%.
Right.
I mean, that's really a race against time between those two things, but
Right.
I don't think we can get enough testing now.
I want to ask you about testing and another backward-looking question, then I want to look forward. You raised the issue, and I've talked to so many people about all the choices that have been made and could be made. You raised the issue, if you've got all these different companies producing tests, that creates a whole bunch of problems. But isn't it also the case that there was no capacity for the government to settle on one choice, maybe two choices, and have those mass produced? That wouldn't have been possible to do either, right?
Well, it just depends on when you decide to invoke the war protective action. As soon
Yeah.
as you say we are at war, then you can do whatever you want. So
But
had that
does
been done early,
but does the capacity exist to get the materials to support the number of tests we need using one particular technology?
well, I think that it does. If you say to all 4 of the testing companies that are doing the most testing now, we are going to go with the Quest Diagnostics test. Everyone stop
Right.
making your own reagents and make theirs, and everybody make the cartridges that go with theirs.
Yeah.
That
If that's true, I think that was history may record that as one of the biggest mistakes that was made because of the importance of testing. I want to talk about going forward now. Your state, Georgia's opening up. A lot of states are, and it leaves citizens with choices about what to do. I hear lots of people in Georgia joke about bowling. I suspect the bowling alleys are going to be disappointed because I don't think a lot of people are going to show up. But for someone who is not in a high risk group, not elderly, doesn't have an underlying condition, what would you tell people to do now if their state opens up? Always wear a mask, I'm sure, but where would you tell people to go? Should they go to retail stores? Should they go to restaurants when those reopen? Or would you tell people to follow a different course until some future point?
the best hope we have at this point is that the virus takes a long time between when you're infected and when you show symptoms, and between when you start having symptoms and the severity gets to the place where you have to go to the emergency department. So the real benefit of sheltering in place right now is to keep yourself away from catching it while scientists figure it out. One reason that I have been an ersatz expert on COVID is because throughout my 20, 30-year career as a physician, mostly I've been doing research. So I have the luxury of being able to really quickly assimilate a lot of what is out there without having to do something else to make money. So because of that, I am really impressed with, there are 1,248 randomized controlled trials registered on the French database that I got from you and from your article. And that's as of yesterday. So many of these trials are going to be underway within the next 2 weeks to a month. So the issue is not for any individual person, do you go out to the bowling alley now? I think the longer people can stay away from other people, the longer we can distance, like was shown in that fantastic ad from Ohio. The longer we're separated, the more time the scientists have to figure out the weird things about this virus that are really different from influenza, different from previous SARS, different from other coronaviruses. So I would wait and give us just another month or two to start figuring things out that can dramatically change the course of illness.
So what would have to happen for you to go to a girls' high school volleyball match?
Well, I'd have to quit being really jealous of tall people before I was even willing to go. But
All right, set that.
all right, so I pretty strongly believe that that we need to look into something called the power of positive deviance and focus on the areas in the world where the death rates are zero, focus on the places where the spread is minimal, and look at what those characteristics are to see if they're possible to emulate. One thing I've been fascinated by recently is that in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, the death rate is zero in all of those countries except for Thailand, where when last I looked, they had like 50 deaths. And so even in Japan, where they did not shut down, the case fatality rate is like 0.21. It is so much lower. So I think that, yes, they wear masks everywhere. Well, so does Singapore. It's still got a fairly high rate. Most of those countries will Y or they will bow. They don't shake hands, but that's also fairly widespread. My current theory I like is that the Southeast Asian countries, about 80% of them do nasal irrigation, and in the same way that we would brush our teeth. And so looking at something like that has a logical background in that it's going to decrease the amount of virus that's replicating. We know it replicates in the nasal passages. We know it takes a long time. There's a lot of esoteric stuff with the pH. But I think that something like that, or some of the other studies that are being done looking at zinc, looking at vitamin D, looking at the National Health Service in the UK is recommending vitamin D and betadine nasal rinses. I mean, so I think that some of these will start to show fruition fairly shortly. Yeah, once we have a way to mitigate the severity, then I would feel comfortable going out into a rock concert or considering stage diving again, but not until we know better.
All right, I want to end with the point you were just making, a very news you can use topic, which is nasal rinses, which you've been very high on to deal with this. So I just want to ask you some practical questions for people. How long would you have to have the virus, in your face for a nasal rinse to be able to help you? In other words, if you get it, if you touch something at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then you've touched your face and it's in there, does the nasal rinse have to happen within X number of hours to be possibly effective to mitigate it?
Yeah, that's why I like this as a potential mitigator, because from the time that you get infected until you start to have enough virus to show symptoms is about 5 to 7 days, which means that this is a really slow replicating virus. Also, only about 10% of people have a positive blood culture when they are tested, which means that most of this spread in the body is not happening through the bloodstream. It's actually happening locally. It's happening bit by bit by bit as it penetrates down from your nasal passages to your oropharynx, to your lungs, to your chest. The other thing that's interesting is that the peculiar age distribution of this virus, children usually have weak immune systems and tend to be sponges for illness, as I well know being in the emergency room. They're not getting it. And an interesting thing about anatomy of children is that they don't develop full sinuses until they're teens. Whereas people who are over the age of 70 have enormous sinuses and nasal cavities, and men have bigger nasal cavities than women. So the solution to pollution is dilution, is what we say when we're looking at wounds or we're cleaning off something that's infected. We'll just spray normal saline on it until it runs clear, and that's part of what we do to decrease the risk of infection with the outside of the body. So it makes sense to me that a twice-a-day nasal irrigation, if you've been exposed, is going to get rid of some of that viral load that is definitely correlated with severity of disease.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a theory there that seems quite practical and sensible that would explain two of the mysteries that people have wondered about, why children aren't showing signs of it and why men are getting it more than women. So that's a really powerful thing that I want people to think more about, read more about. So I've done nasal irrigation for a variety, yeah, and test, that's right. I've done nasal irrigation for a variety of things, and it's incredibly inconvenient as far as I'm concerned for a variety of reasons, including having to clean the equipment, and not everybody likes the way it feels. If somebody wants to follow your advice and do nasal irrigation twice a day now, what do they need to buy to do it most effectively? And I would say in a way that they're not going to be turned off after doing it twice.
I had never done nasal irrigation before, and I hate getting water up my nose, so I was not about this. But once it became logical, I tried it, and it's not that bad. It's certainly not elegant. I did it on my Facebook Live on the Buzzy Helps Facebook page, because now is no time for vanity. So I dribbled snot out of my nose. Really, it's any kind of a container that can have a small amount of pressure, and about 8 ounces is probably the right amount to use. So their neti pot is something that pours in like that. It doesn't have high pressure, and I do think that the more pressure to irrigate, certainly when we're doing wounds, we try to get really high pressure with a 60 cc syringe. So if you've got
So if you're going on Amazon right now and you want to buy the right stuff, what do you need to buy?
Neilmed Sinus Rinse 8 ounce bottle, and then make your own packets with a half teaspoon of baking soda and a half teaspoon to a teaspoon of salt per 8 ounces. And I am enamored, if you do think that you've actually been exposed, I'm enamored of the betadine, which is povidone, iodine, and a half teaspoon of that. So mix all those 3 things together. The good thing is it can't hurt you so long as you use distilled water, or you boil it and let it come to room temperature. There certainly are other ways to do nasal irrigation, but I think that's one of the cheapest.
And are those recipes available on your website now?
Well, or on the National Health Service. You look up NHS nasal rinse. Yes, they are on our website. So you could go to the buzzyhelps.com link, but it's also readily available everywhere. I think that there's some interesting nuances. I think that hypertonic saline, so making it a little more salty, may pull out more of the fluid in your nasal cavities. I think that one group in Vanderbilt is looking at surfactant, which is basically baby shampoo, but it's something that breaks apart, just like soap. It breaks apart the outside of the lipid layer, and so I think that'll be an interesting thing to see. And the greater alkalinity, so more baking soda makes it more alkaline. It looks like most coronaviruses in the past have had to fuse the lipid layer with the cell at approximately 6.8 to 7.2. So if you can make it a little more alkaline, it may be that it is less likely to be able to fuse. So all of those things are things that I think we just need some randomized controlled trials. But if nothing else, rinsing it out has a lot of good support.
And did I understand you say you want people to experiment doing nasal rinses with baby shampoo?
I am not a fan of that. Vanderbilt is looking at half a teaspoon of baby shampoo. There's a logic behind it, but there's also the possibility that it could irritate the nasal sinuses. So I think that the straightforward irrigation is an ample thing that I can get behind right now. I think that the iodine, the betadine, that has good support and has research and data behind it. And I think that all of the other nuances are things that I calculated it'll take about 200 people in a trial to be able to see if we can reduce the severity from 20% having emergency department visits and hospitalizations down to 10%. So that's not that many people to test.
Well, I hope there's such clinical trials, but I will not volunteer for a clinical trial that involves putting baby shampoo up my nose. That's just me. Dr. Amy Baxter, the CEO, Chief Medical Officer of Pain Care Labs, and someone who, like a lot of doctors I know, have figured out in a fast and effective and efficient way how to be expert on the medical question of our time. Dr. Amy Baxter, CEO and Chief Medical Officer of Pain Care Labs, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. We appreciate you watching. I'm Mark Halperin for Wide World of News. We'll see you back here again very soon.